The first thing I noticed wasn't the color. It was the silence. My lawnmower was still sitting exactly where I'd left it before leaving town for the weekend. The maple tree was casting the same long afternoon shadow across the yard. Birds were still picking at the flower bed my late wife had planted years ago. But the fence between my property and my neighbors looked like somebody had dropped a bucket of glowing green paint straight out of a science fiction movie. I actually stopped walking halfway up my driveway because my brain refused to believe what my eyes were seeing. For a second, I wondered if the sunlight was playing tricks on me. Then I blinked twice, looked again, and somehow it looked even brighter. It wasn't just green, either. It was that loud, almost electric neon color you usually see on traffic safety jackets. The kind of shade that practically shines back at you. Every other fence in our neighborhood had the same warm cedar stain we'd all agreed on years ago. Simple, clean, nothing fancy. Mine now looked like someone had sliced the block in half with a highlighter. Before I could even process it, I heard a cheerful voice from next door. "Well, what do you think?" I turned and saw my new neighbor, Grant Holloway, standing proudly beside a paint roller, hands on his hips like he'd just finished restoring the Statue of Liberty. I looked at him, then back at the fence, then at him again. "Please tell me this is some kind of joke." He laughed. Not in the mean way exactly. More like someone convinced everyone else would eventually appreciate his genius. "Come on, Nate. It gives the neighborhood some personality. I wish I could tell you I exploded right there. But that's never really been my style. I spent most of my adult life fixing problems instead of creating them. 22 years as a mechanical engineer teaches you that nearly everything can be solved if people are willing to have an honest conversation. So I walked over, rested my hand on the fence, still tacky from fresh paint, and said as calmly as I could, "Grant, this isn't just your fence." His smile faded just a little. "It's on my side." "No," I answered. "It's on the property line. We both own it." He shrugged like ownership was just another opinion. "It's only paint." Funny how people always say that when it's someone else's property. We'd lived in Willow Creek for almost 14 years. It wasn't one of those gated luxury communities you see on television. It was just a quiet suburb outside Columbus where kids still rode bikes after dinner, retirees waved from their porches, and most disagreements ended with somebody bringing over cookies a few days later. The HOA had rules, sure, but they mostly stayed out of everyone's lives unless someone did something truly ridiculous. Until Grant moved in 8 months earlier. I honestly couldn't remember the last neighborhood argument that lasted longer than a weekend. At first I liked him. He was energetic, friendly enough, always talking about fresh ideas and modern upgrades. During his first month, he planted colorful flowers, installed new porch lights, even helped an elderly couple carry groceries after a storm. Nobody had a bad word to say about him. Looking back now, I think the warning signs were there from the beginning. Every compliment came with criticism. Every improvement required changing something that had worked perfectly fine for years. People get stuck in old habits. He'd tell anyone willing to listen. Sometimes neighborhoods need someone brave enough to shake things up. I never imagined I'd become part of his experiment. About 3 weeks before the paint incident, Grant casually mentioned he was planning a little fence project. I assumed he meant replacing damaged boards or resealing the wood. We'd actually split maintenance costs the previous summer after a heavy windstorm knocked several panels loose, and that whole process took less than 10 minutes because we simply agreed on everything. I figured this would be more of the same. Instead, while I was visiting my daughter and grandson for the weekend, Grant apparently decided asking permission would only slow him down. Later I'd learned he'd spent 2 full days sanding and painting every visible board without making a single phone call. When I asked why he never reached out, he smiled again, though this time there was something smug hiding underneath it. "I figured you'd thank me afterward." I couldn't help laughing, mostly because the alternative was saying something I'd regret. "Grant, nobody thanks a neighbor for repainting shared property without asking." He crossed his arms. "You're making a bigger deal out of this than it deserves." "Am I?" I asked quietly. "Imagine if I walked into your backyard while you were away and painted your deck bright purple because I liked it better." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the fence as if admiring his own work all over again. "That's different." "How?" Another shrug. "Because I have good taste." I wish I were making that line up. I stood there for another minute, hoping common sense would eventually find its way into the conversation. But every sentence seemed to push us farther apart instead of bringing us closer. Finally, I sighed and said, "Look, I'm not interested in fighting with you. Let's just fix it together." He shook his head before I even finished speaking. "Not happening." That was the exact moment I realized this was no longer about paint. It was about pride. Later that evening, I pulled out the neighborhood handbook we'd received years ago. mostly expecting to confirm what I already knew. Buried inside the architectural guidelines was a section I'd almost forgotten existed. Shared exterior structures visible from adjacent lots required prior approval before any significant color change. Fence finishes had to match one of the approved community stains. It wasn't complicated, it wasn't hidden in legal language, and it certainly wasn't open to interpretation. The next morning, I decided not to argue anymore. I simply documented the fence, took photographs from both properties, wrote one respectful email to the HOA explaining exactly what had happened, and made one request, not for punishment, not for revenge, just for the fence to be restored to the color both homeowners had originally agreed upon. I honestly believed the whole thing would be resolved within a week. I had no idea that little email was about to uncover something much bigger than a bright green fence. And I definitely didn't expect the man next door to turn a simple mistake into the most expensive lesson our neighborhood had seen in years. I expected an email from the HOA within a day or two. Maybe a polite note saying they'd reach out to Grant. Maybe a request for more photos. Honestly, I thought this whole thing would be over before the next weekend barbecue rolled around. But Monday came and went, then Tuesday. And by Wednesday afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself they had bigger things to worry about than one painfully bright fence. Then I heard the familiar sound of a mailbox lid slamming shut. I walked outside to grab my mail and noticed Grant standing at his mailbox with a white envelope in his hand. Even from 20 feet away, I recognized the HOA return address. He looked at it for maybe 3 seconds before laughing to himself, tearing it clean in half, then tossing the pieces into his recycling bin like it was junk mail from a cable company. He caught me watching and grinned. Guess they finally noticed my masterpiece. I answered, looks like it. He leaned against his truck and said, they'll send one scary letter, then they'll move on. They always do. There was a confidence in his voice that made me wonder if he'd gotten away with this sort of thing before. I didn't respond because there wasn't much left to say. The rules existed. The board had been notified. Whatever happened next wasn't really between him and me anymore. Over the next few days, the fence became something of a neighborhood attraction. People slowed down while walking their dogs. Kids pointed at it. Delivery drivers stared. One teenage boy riding his bike actually yelled, "Cool color," before disappearing around the corner. Older neighbors weren't nearly as enthusiastic. Mrs. Donnelly from 3 houses down quietly asked me whether I'd approved it. When I told her no, she frowned and said, "That's not right." She didn't raise her voice, didn't start gossiping. She simply shook her head and kept walking. That seemed to be the general mood around Willow Creek. People weren't angry because of the color itself. They were uncomfortable because everyone understood an invisible line had been crossed. Around here, we all trimmed branches that hung over shared property. We warned each other before noisy projects. We borrowed ladders and returned them cleaner than we received them. Nobody had ever needed a rule book to explain basic respect. The following Friday, architectural compliance inspector drove slowly through the neighborhood. I happened to be watering the flower beds when she stopped near the fence, stepped out with a tablet, took several photographs from different angles, measured something with a laser device, nodded to herself, then drove away without speaking to either of us. Grant came outside just in time to see her leaving. "Guess I'm famous now," he joked. I simply went back to watering my roses. 3 days later, another certified letter arrived. This time he didn't tear it up immediately. Instead, he opened it right there beside the mailbox. I watched his smile disappear almost as quickly as it had appeared. He folded the letter, slipped it into his back pocket, glanced toward my house, then walked inside without saying a word. That evening, I logged into the HOA resident portal out of curiosity. Sure enough, the weekly board minutes had already been posted. Without naming homeowners, they listed a recent architectural violation involving an unauthorized exterior modification to a shared structure. The owner had 7 days to restore the fence to an approved finish or daily fines would begin. It wasn't personal. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply procedure. I figured Grant would repaint it over the weekend and we'd both move on with our lives. Instead, Saturday morning, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of a pressure washer. I looked outside expecting to see him removing the neon paint. What I saw instead nearly made me laugh. He was washing his driveway. The fence remained exactly as bright as ever. Around lunchtime, he wandered over carrying a soda. "You know," he said casually, "you could have just talked to me instead of running to the HOA." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Grant, I did talk to you for like 2 minutes. I asked you to fix it. You demanded I undo my work because you changed shared property without asking." He sighed dramatically as though he were the reasonable one. This neighborhood hates change. I looked him square in the eye and answered, "No. It hates surprises that belong to someone else." For the first time since we'd met, Neither of us smiled. The conversation ended there. The following Monday, the fines officially began. $25 a day wasn't exactly life-changing, and judging by the way Grant mowed his lawn with headphones on and waved cheerfully at passing cars, he wasn't worried in the slightest. About a week later, he posted photos of the fence in a community social media group with the caption, "Sometimes progress makes people uncomfortable." The comments surprised me. A few praised the bold color, but most weren't discussing paint at all. They were asking one simple question: did your neighbor agree to this? Grant never answered that part. Instead, he argued about creativity, property rights, and personal freedom. Then one of the older residents replied with a sentence that shifted the entire conversation. "Freedom ends where shared ownership begins." After that, public opinion changed fast. People weren't defending the HOA. They were defending the idea that neighbors should ask before making decisions that affect someone else. At the next monthly board meeting I attended mostly to listen. I had no speech prepared and no desire to embarrass anyone. When the open forum began, I stood up, introduced myself, and asked only one question. If this rule isn't enforced fairly, how do you decide which shared property rules matter and which ones don't? The room went quiet for a moment before the board president answered. "We enforce the governing documents equally because consistency protects every homeowner." That was all I wanted to hear. I sat back down. Across the room, Grant avoided looking in my direction. 2 weeks later, the daily fine doubled. Then the compliance committee hired an independent contractor to inspect the fence and prepare a restoration estimate. That's when everything changed. The contractor explained that the fluorescent paint had soaked deep into the wood grain. Matching the neighborhood stain wouldn't be as simple as rolling brown paint over green. Every board would need to be sanded almost to bare wood, treated with a primer designed to block color bleed, then stained twice to restore a consistent finish. The estimate was several times higher than what the original staining project would have cost. When the contractor left, Grant stood alone in his driveway staring at the fence for nearly 10 minutes. For the first time since this whole mess began, he didn't look proud. He looked tired. 3 evenings later, there was a knock on my front door. I opened it to find Grant standing there with no jokes, no grin, no confidence, just a folded estimate in his hand. He looked down for a second before finally saying, "I think maybe we should talk." Grant stood on my front porch looking nothing like the man who had proudly admired that glowing fence just a few weeks earlier. His shoulders had dropped, the confidence in his voice had disappeared, and the folded estimate in his hand looked like it weighed 50 pounds. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I messed this up." Those 4 words surprised me more than the paint ever had. I stepped aside and invited him in. We sat at the kitchen table where my wife and I had shared countless cups of coffee over the years, and for the first time since he'd moved next door, Grant stopped trying to win an argument. He admitted he'd convinced himself everyone else was simply resistant to change. He said he'd spent years renovating homes before moving into Willow Creek, and he'd grown used to making decisions without asking anyone because every property had belonged entirely to him. Somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that living beside people wasn't the same as flipping houses. I listened without interrupting because, truthfully, this conversation was the one I'd hoped we'd have from the very beginning. After a while, he slid the contractor's estimate across the table. "I can't believe repainting it is going to cost this much." I glanced at the number, then pushed the paper back toward him. "The paint isn't what's expensive," I said quietly. "Ignoring people usually is." He let out a tired laugh, the kind that comes when you realize someone else has been right all along. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. "Would you tell the HOA to drop it?" I shook my head, not because I wanted him punished, but because that decision had never belonged to me. "I asked them for one thing," I reminded him. "Restore the fence. That's still all I want." He nodded slowly, and for the first time, there wasn't even a hint of resentment on his face. The following week, contractors arrived early each morning. The bright green disappeared one section at a time under layers of sanding, dust, and fresh stain. It took several days because every board had to be stripped properly before the approved cedar finish could be applied. Neighbors walking by slowed down, smiled politely, and kept moving. Nobody celebrated. Nobody mocked Grant. Around here, people appreciated seeing a mistake corrected far more than seeing someone embarrassed. Once the work was finished, the fence looked exactly the way it had before any of this started. It blended into the neighborhood so naturally that within a few days, most people probably forgot it had ever been different. But I didn't forget. And judging by the way Grant quietly watched the workers pack up their equipment on that final afternoon, neither did he. The HOA eventually reduced part of the accumulated fines after confirming the violation had been fully corrected. But Grant still paid far more than he would have if he'd simply knocked on my door that first Saturday morning. A few months passed. Summer turned into early fall, and life slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. Then one Saturday afternoon, there was another knock at my door. This time Grant was holding a homemade apple pie. He smiled awkwardly and said, "My sister insisted I shouldn't show up empty-handed." I laughed and invited him onto the porch. We spent nearly an hour talking about football, yard work, and everything except the fence. Before he left, he looked out across the property line and quietly said, "You know, I kept thinking this whole thing was about paint." I nodded. Most people would. He looked back at me. But it never was. Was it? No, I answered. It was about making a decision that affected both of us without giving one of us a voice. He stared at the restored fence for another moment before saying, "I understand that now. Looking back, I don't think either of us really won." Grant lost money, time, and a good deal of pride. I lost weeks of peace and a neighbor I'd hoped would become a friend much sooner. If there's any victory in this story, it's that respect finally showed up, even if it arrived later than it should have. Neighborhoods aren't held together by fences, bylaws, or HOA meetings. They're held together by thousands of ordinary decisions people make every single year. Little moments when someone chooses to ask instead of assume, to listen instead of insist, to remember that living in a community means sharing more than a property line. Every now and then I still catch myself looking at that fence while I'm mowing the lawn. Most people would only see stained cedar boards. I see a reminder that pride can turn a 5-minute conversation into a months-long conflict, and that sometimes the strongest response isn't yelling louder or getting even. Sometimes it's simply letting the rules do exactly what they were written to do while refusing to let anger make the decisions for you. Now I'm curious what you think. If you'd come home and found your shared fence painted without your permission, would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have done something completely different? Was Grant treated fairly once the HOA stepped in? Or did the fines go too far? Share your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this rarely have only one side. And some of the most interesting conversations happen after the story ends.